I've just announced 2 days ago the approval by government to privatize ZCCM by dismantling it into 4 packages. We think that this will be a tremendous boost to the Zambian economy and a measure of how confident we are as a party that our economic policies are taking root.
Victor Sims, the Zed His Story. Now, in the early hours of November 6, 1998, at around 5 a.m. in the morning, a home in the affluent neighborhood of Ibex in Lusaka became the hapless stage for the unfolding of a chilling murder. In this nocturnal realm, the atmosphere seemed to hold its breath, as if aware of the impending tragedy that would soon unfold. Police arrived the very next morning, much to the surprise of the neighbors. The suspected house stood as a silent witness, its doors and windows guarding the truth that would soon be shattered. The victim, 41, was found in a pool of blood, his body still warm and riddled with bullet holes. According to his wife, who witnessed the shooting, her husband was killed in her presence by a 6-man team that overpowered the security men and guard dog. After viewing the body, it didn't take long for police to realize that the victim was none other than Ronald Penza, a renowned finance minister of global acclaim. Over the past years, Penza became especially popular for various reasons after he oversaw the most radical privatization program in Africa at the time. This was the man that almost single-handedly dismantled the socialist policies put in place by the country's first Republican president, Kenneth Kaunda. Ironically, he had been fired by President Chiluba not more than 7 months prior. Now, despite the killers fleeing the scene without taking anything, the police immediately announced that robbery was the motive. And within just 6 hours of the killing, a squad of police officers had shot down 5 men alleged to be part of the Penza murder gang as they attempted to rob a petrol station. 2 weeks later, then police spokesperson Binwo Chivembe announced that 3 more suspects had been gunned down in connection with Penza's murder, bringing the total number of suspects killed by the police to 8. Among the first 5 suspects killed by the police was Chanda Chayafya, a security guard with Amco Security Limited who switched shifts with colleagues to guard Penza's residence. Apparently, a group of 17 police in plainclothes picked up Chayafya from his workplace for questioning in the morning. 6 hours later, he was found dead in a remote area near Chazanga Township on the outskirts of Lusaka. Legs broken with cigarette burns and rope marks around his hands. Also arrested in connection with the murder was a newspaper vendor and a market trader, considered as prime suspects as police tried to unravel the Penza mystery. However, little did they know that their journey would be filled with twists, turns, and a trail of secrets that would lead many to question everything.
"27 years ago, UNIP promised us a better road to the future. Since then, they have run the country into the ground. The economy has collapsed. We have shortages of food and medicines. Prices have skyrocketed. Transport and education have virtually stopped. Corruption is rife. Don't trust UNIP again. On election day, we can vote for a new government. Vote MMD and set yourself free. MMD, the hour has come."
After nearly 20 years of one-party rule, multi-party elections were reintroduced in November 1991 and resulted in the victory of the Movement for Multi-Party Democracy, MMD, with the slogan, "The hour has come," and the election of the gifted orator and showman Frederick Jacob Titus Chiluba, a former trade unionist, as president.
Eno mwatwala kuliba lya kabiri abana elya n'okunwa ebo mwebya diyo mwentungulushya amafumo yawo amakabiriza ni mutungulule.
Members of the MMD were drawn from a broad coalition of trade unionists, businessmen, intellectuals, and students. Initially, Ronald Penza rose to prominence after 1991 when he ran as a candidate for a parliamentary seat under the Movement for Multi-Party Democracy, MMD. He won the Munali constituency with at least 82% of the votes against Rukia Banda at the dawn of the Third Republic. Shortly after the elections of Frederick Chiluba and the MMD, Ronald Penza was appointed Minister of Commerce, Trade and Industry. And later, following a cabinet reshuffle in 1993, he was appointed Minister of Finance. Most notably, the MMD in its election manifesto committed itself to implementing liberal economic reform. This, of course, had been attempted in the early 1980s by UNIP's one-party government without success. But the MMD's plans were different. Theirs was a double-barreled strategy of political as well as economic transformation. Besides, they had the support, or rather strong encouragement, from the Bretton Woods institutions. In 1992, barely a year after assuming power, the MMD government embarked on what was known as the Structural Adjustment Program. The Bretton Woods institutions, specifically the IMF and World Bank, advocated for the program as a precondition for borrowing developmental funds. Initially, when the program was launched, there was a tremendous hope for an economic turnaround. However, hope would soon turn into despair as things would quickly move from bad to worse. On the one hand, the majority of people were poor, and in many instances, getting poorer. And on the other hand, in the absence of progressive social reforms, the imported concept of democracy, which propagated the idea of rights and political equality, was largely failing to yield results. To be sure, amongst the nations of sub-Saharan Africa, Zambia suffered one of the greatest and most rapid economic declines starting in the early 1970s. According to one estimate, GDP declined by 30% between 1975 and 1990. Ironically, Zambia's relationship with multilateral financial institutions began in 1973. Now, it is important to note that the Structure Adjustment Program was not Chiluba's idea, and neither did it emerge after 1990. As mentioned, stability measures and structure adjustment programs were introduced between 1973 and 1990. However, they all failed to address the underlying structural problems of the Zambian economy, which included a huge and lavish state sector, inefficient agricultural production, and an unsustainable policy of food subsidies. Now, even I must admit that Zambia's economic policies in the 1990s were exceedingly complex. But within the first 2 years of assuming power, the MMD government had completed the liberalization of the external and domestic trade regime by eliminating tariffs, freeing exchange and interest rates, and launching an extensive privatization program, which in 1996 was praised by the international press and the World Bank to be one of the most successful on a world scale. Earlier in 1994, Ronald Penza, who oversaw the privatization program, was nominated by the financial magazine Euromoney, published by the World Bank and the IMF, as the second best finance minister in the world. However, while in the early 90s, the pace of privatization was considered impressive under the Chiluba regime, there was still one significant asset that had delayed to be privatized: the Zambia Consolidated Copper Mines, ZCCM. Due to Zambia's dependence on copper, the privatization of the mines was always the main issue in terms of a potential economic reversal. But it was only in 1996 that the government accepted the advice to begin the process of privatization of ZCCM. And with that process came chaos.
Hello once again and welcome to Privatization. Government appears to be committed.
We will ensure as government that not only do we keep the promises, but we work as responsibly as possible to ensure that we succeed.
The decision to privatize ZCCM was made during a fierce debate with bilateral donors in the aftermath of the controversial 1996 presidential and parliamentary elections, during which the MMD used its parliamentary majority to push through constitutional amendments that denied the strongest opposition candidate, former President Kenneth Kaunda of UNIP, the possibility to contest the presidency. Meanwhile, the international bidding process for the main assets of ZCCM was closed on February 28, 1997, and 26 companies had submitted their bids. However, shortly after the process of bid analysis and evaluation had begun, President Chiluba removed the mining conglomerate from Zambia's privatization agency's portfolio and picked a new negotiating team to be led by then Executive Director of ZCCM, Francis Kaunda. Now, Francis Kaunda was an interesting guy and considered one of the greatest minds of his generation. Initially admitted to the School of Medicine at the University of Ghana in 1961, he was convinced by Kenneth Kaunda to transfer into social sciences, as Kaunda needed more people with administrative skills for his first government. Francis Kaunda was educated at Howard University in the US and often attended summer school at Georgetown University. Thus, through his studies, he met people like Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., and of course, Malcolm Little, aka Malcolm X. In November 1997, negotiations for the sale of ZCCM's main assets were completed and finalization of transaction agreements with Kafua Consortium were scheduled for March 1998. Now here's where it gets interesting. In the very March of 98, in yet another surprising move, Chiluba dismissed then Minister of Finance Ronald Penza and turned down the bid from Kafua Consortium. And after several failed discussions with government, Kafua Consortium withdrew entirely from the process. And for the next 2 years, ZCCM would go on to make losses amounting to nearly $300 million, with maintenance costs alone costing the Zambian government at least $1 million per month. In December 1998, the directors of Anglo-American Corporation ratified a memorandum of understanding on the sale of ZCCM assets. With pressure coming in from the international financial institutions, in 1999, the government began to entertain a much lower offer for ZCCM assets from Anglo-American Corporation. It was expected that the sale would be completed by mid-March 1999, but the final sale of the mines was only completed on March 31st in the year 2000.
From the outset, the investors had the upper hand in the sales negotiations. Copper prices had hit rock bottom and the state was running out of money. Its debt to the World Bank and the IMF was so large they could not get new loans. Zambia had its back against the wall and was forced to sell.
The executive board were more and more nervous about that. So the board let me with no initiative but to get the money back and not to extend more credit to that country if we are not repaid or if we don't invent a scheme to be repaid.
The mines was the last great resource that the state held, and the bank and fund were very keen for the mines to be privatized. And so they made it a condition of a series of loans to Zambia and a series of debt relief initiatives that the mines be privatized.
As the ZCCM dust settled, people began asking the obvious questions. Why did Kafio Consortium pull out of negotiations? Why did the Chiluba government accept a lower bid from Anglo-American Corporation? And the most insistent of all, who killed Ronald Penza? The circumstances surrounding the killing of Mr. Ronald Penza were mysterious to say the least. Penza is said to have died only hours before he was to testify against 3 cabinet ministers in a court case. The coincidence was not lost on many, as some, like General Christian Tembo, leader of the opposition Forum for Democracy and Development (FDD), and Anderson Mazoka of the United Party for National Development (UPND), called it a state-sponsored crime and a witch hunt by the MMD government. One Western economist based in Osaka speculated that Penza may have been killed because he knew too much about government corruption, including its stewardship over the crumbling remains of the country's biggest industry, the state-owned Zambian Consolidated Copper Mines, ZCCM.
We were basically under the instructions of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund.
The IMF has never imposed a privatization, not in the case of Zambia. But what occurred frequently is that governments have said to their public opinion, we are privatizing because the World Bank and the IMF tell us that if we don't do that, they will not finance us. But it is not correct, or it is only partially correct.
Others speculated that Penza was killed due to opposition to an oil supply contract, which was awarded to a company that had lost a tender bid. Penza apparently opposed the Ministry of Energy's awarding of a contract to a company which had been turned down by the Zambian National Tender Board, which he chaired. Based on the provided narratives and the circumstances surrounding the killing of Mr. Ronald Penza, several scenarios can be analyzed to try and understand why Mr. Ronald Penza was killed and who could have been responsible. Let's begin with motive. The first is the alleged political conspiracy. According to this hypothesis, Penza's involvement in exposing government corruption and his upcoming testimony against cabinet ministers suggests a potential motive for the ruling MMD government to silence him. This points to a politically motivated crime aimed at protecting the interests of powerful individuals within the government. The next is business interests. Here, Penza's role in overseeing the privatization of ZCCM and his opposition to certain contracts may have enraged influential business figures. Further, given Penza's influence as a former finance minister, it is conceivable that powerful business interests could have been involved in his murder to protect their own economic interests. This scenario could involve individuals within the business community with sufficient resources and influence to carry out such a crime. Lastly, it's personal grudge or revenge. Although less likely, it is plausible that Penza's murder could have been motivated by personal reasons. This could involve individuals who held personal grudges against him or sought revenge for past actions. However, this scenario appears less probable given Penza's position as a prominent political figure and the level of planning and coordination involved in the killing. Which brings us to the crime scene. If we go back and analyze the crime scene, we discover that the murder occurred at Penza's home, a well-secured house in an affluent neighborhood. This suggests a level of familiarity and premeditation by the perpetrators. This further indicates that the crime was not circumstantial, but likely targeted specifically at Penza. In addition, the absence of robbery suggests that financial gain was not the primary motive. Instead, it strengthens the possibility of a politically or economically motivated assassination. The involvement of the 6-man team further suggests a well-organized and planned operation. This implies that the murder was not a random act of violence, but rather a carefully planned and orchestrated assignment. The overpowering of security guards and guard dogs equally implies a high level of coordination and preparation by the perpetrators, and further supports the theory of a targeted and planned attack. And finally, there's the aftermath. And here, the swift response from the police and their subsequent actions of killing multiple suspects raises questions about their involvement or a potential cover-up. It suggests a possibility of collusion in an attempt to quickly close the case and avoid further investigations. Furthermore, the subsequent deaths of suspects, including Chanda Chayafia, the security guard who switched shifts to guard Penza's residence, raises suspicion of a cover-up or an attempt to eliminate witnesses who could reveal critical information. All in all, determining the likelihood of each scenario presented here is challenging without additional information and evidence. To establish a clearer understanding of the motives and culprits behind Penza's murder, a thorough investigation with access to additional facts, testimonies, and perhaps forensic evidence would be necessary. The murder of Ronald Penza remains an unsolved mystery, leaving behind unanswered questions and lingering shadows over Zambia's political landscape, as many continue to ask, who killed Ronald Penza?
No, ya comí.